Next. Now, this is the slide that has the 32nd on there. There's Belshazzar, and he sees God's handwriting on the wall. You know, you look up these things on Google, and you look at the picture, and you say, where do these guys' heads come from? You don't know what they're doing. Next slide. Or does it? Okay. After chapter 4, nearly 25 years have passed since the events of chapter 4 and over 70 years since chapter 1. So you can see that Daniel is writing his life down in the book of Daniel. Now advanced in years, Daniel is a senior statesman in Babylon. He has outlasted a number of kings, and in his time, Belshazzar, the last of the Chaldean kings of Babylon, will be killed, and Babylon will pass from the Chaldeans' rule to rule by Darius the Medes and Persians. Daniel, here's the dates. 562, we don't need to read this, but you can glance it. Now, I wanted to say Nebuchadnezzar dies and is replaced by a succession of short-lived kings. 556 BC, Nabonidus. I don't know if I said that right, but if you're the first guy who ever said it, then you're the right guy. He married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, and Nabonidus appoints his son Belshazzar to be his co-regent. So, reading in the commentators, the light is shining. Reading in the commentators, they say that there's no term for grandfather in the Aramaic. So in chapter 5, Daniel addresses Belshazzar as his father. And here all the liberal critics are complaining and say, everything's so mixed up because Belshazzar, the years and all the dates. Anyways, it's his grandfather. Good. I would suppose there's a little irony in the fact that God humbled the most arrogant king of the entire Babylonian Empire. The message of this chapter is God is sovereign over all kingdoms and kings, including the head of the Babylonian Empire. Now in chapter 5, the dynasty of the last ruler of the Golden Empire comes to an end. They were praising the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron. Then they used the sacred items from the temple in Jerusalem. Verse 1-4. Okay. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver and Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem he brought, that the kings and his lords and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So Nebuchadnezzar never did this, but Belshazzar did. Belshazzar was not afraid of the siege surrounding the city. Like the Persians were moving in while this was happening. He was confident because the Babylonians' impressive defenses and his vast supplies. He's got it made. And if I don't mention this tonight somewhere in this PowerPoint, I have a tendency to go scrambly crazy. In 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 3, it says, when they say peace and safety, sudden destruction will come upon them. That's a backdrop to Daniel chapter 5. When they say peace and safety, because they thought everything was okay and their empire is going to come to an end. Conservative calculations set the dimensions of the ancient city of Babylon like this. The outer walls were 17 miles long. The walls were 22 feet thick and about 90 meters high. I'm reading. The outer walls had a guard towers another 100 feet high. The gates were made of bronze. There's about 100 of them. A system of inner and outer walls and moats made the city very secure. The Euphrates River runs in from one end and exits the other, and they made the Euphrates River circle the walls of Babylon. The other commentators said that the walls were over 300 feet high, and you can pass 4 sets of chariots on the top floor, on the top wall. So it's bigger than anything in Campbell River, absolutely. Okay. Next. Nay, they brought in the gold vessels. Did I read this already? They brought in the gold vessels and had that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of silver, God of silver, bronze, and wood and stone. So now when Daniel's writing this, he thinks this is just useless. That's why he says they're praising the gods of, there is only one God, and we are the same. But he says they praise the gods of gold and silver and bronze and wood and stone. Yeah. Now, this is interesting. I keep saying that. 1,000 of his lords is no exaggeration. Babylonian and Persian courts had huge establishments. Historical evidence tells us that the Persian ruler provided for 15,000 daily guests. There, guys, these are all government employees. This is the best job in the world. King Ashurnashirpal had a feast where over 69,000 people feasted over a 10-day period. Alexander the Great had 10,000 people at his wedding guests. So they went to town on revelry. 2 Chronicles. Okay, this is talking about a king named Jephron. He was 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, and he departed with no one's regret. They buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. So if you read 2 Chronicles chapter 21, it tells you about a useless king that was wicked. His father Jehoshaphat got him to marry the daughter of Jezebel. Bad combination. They forgot to go through marriage counseling. And he did a lot of evil things. When he passed away, no one regretted him. And so this verse is used as a tool to say, make your life mean something other than just living for yourself. But that's what Belshazzar is doing. Okay. Now I just finished repeating to my head the same thing that the next slide is telling me. I do this all the time. Okay, go back anyways. Let's see if I'm any good at this. Can you imagine living your entire life by giving consideration only to your own needs and wants? Yet there are many who live like this. They live for themselves without any consideration for the benefit of others. The problem is you and I know people like this, and they see nothing wrong with that kind of living. God help us with people. Christ called a certain rich man a fool, not because of any outrageous deed, but because he took for granted that he was his own and he lived accordingly. There is a connection here between the act of blasphemy and the temple vessels and the message of judgment. So judgment is coming to Belshazzar. Now, immediately, the fingers of a human hand. Okay, let's not go any farther. Did you know that if you take a look at Luke, the book of Luke in the New Testament, Jesus mentions the word finger of God in Luke chapter 11, verse 20. And I'm going to read it for you because I like doing this kind of stuff. Luke 11, verse 20, and it says there, I'll back up. If I cast out demons by Beelzebul, and by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they will be your judge. But if it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. So Jesus used that term, finger of God. So in this passage here in Daniel 5, a hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. They've done archaeological digging, and they found that there's these big, huge top establishments, places where they'd have these big parties. So while they're getting plastered, God is writing on the plaster on the wall. Dumb joke. Then the kings, now this is actually pretty serious because it got their attention. Like they were just involved in revelry, and they had a revelation happen here. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters. Okay, like you remember in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he brings in the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. And then in chapter 4, he does the same thing again. Will these guys, these union characters, ever give up their jobs and just say, look, let Daniel answer the question because we're useless? And that is the message of the Gentiles. They have no resources, no wisdom that matters other than God's word. Then the king's color changed. The king called loudly to bring these guys in. Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and be the third ruler in the kingdom. Okay, next slide. He shall be the third ruler of his kingdom. Archaeologists have discovered that Belshazzar offered the interpreter of the dream third place in the kingdom. The real king was Nabonidus. He was always in Arabia all the time on holidays. He didn't like working. And his son Belshazzar ruled as second in the kingdom. Belshazzar couldn't give away the second place in the kingdom because he was in the second in the kingdom at the time. The best he could offer is third place. So you can see Daniel coming up and say, third place, that's not worth it. You guys are not. Next. In his long suffering and mercy, God may allow men to continue in their sin for a time, but there is a time for judgment. The king and his Babylonian dinner guests crossed the line that fateful night in the banquet hall of Babylon. Judgment day has come, and with the writing on the wall, their last day arrived. Verse 10 to 16. The queen, however, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. Like usually the women know just about everything when something goes wrong. I'm not joking, it's serious. O king, live forever. Let not your tongues alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Next verse will say, in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. I have a link on my phone. I don't want to share it with you because it's kind of redundant, but there is a pun between Belshazzar and Belteshazzar, because if you go back one slide, if you go back to that, Belteshazzar is Daniel, and Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And when Daniel wrote the book of Daniel, he made a play on between Belteshazzar and Belshazzar, and it's kind of interesting, but it's a rabbit hole. It's just a real rabbit hole. Next. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, now listen to how he says it. You are that Daniel. Okay, so you're saying to him in the third person, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah. Always bring in the fact that you're in exile. You are the Daniel from Judah, the king that my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you. They have no other idea that there is a God of heaven. They say in their mindset from the Babylonian way, gods, small g, very small g. And that light and understanding, excellent wisdom are found in you. Okay. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read the writing and to make known to me its interpretation. But they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give the interpretation and solve problems. If you can read the writing and make known to me the interpretation, you'll be clothed with purple. I don't know why purple is so popular. And have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, the next slide. One might have thought that the king was having a heart attack. Barely being able to stand, his face was seamed with terror. The laughter turned into deafening silence with all eyes on the king. The king's eyes were fixed upon the hand as it wrote, and a sense of panic fell on the crowd. All eyes were turned to the mysterious writing on the wall. The queen is probably Nebuchadnezzar's widow, and her description of Daniel shows he was no stranger to her. Now, then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be to yourself." Now, is that a nice thing to say? Keep your gifts to yourself. Not really, because he didn't want any gifts. And if you read Daniel chapter 4, you'll see that when Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about a tree and big blossoms, Daniel said, "May this dream be for your enemies, Nebuchadnezzar, and may you find hope with God." So Daniel had a closer relationship with Nebuchadnezzar than he did with Belshazzar. And as you can tell by him saying this, "Let your gifts be for yourself," and Belshazzar's response to him saying, "Oh, you are that Daniel." So there's the distance there. And Daniel was probably the smartest person in his kingdom, but Belshazzar was rather drink from sacred goblets from the temple. In chapter 4, verses 19 and 20, it reveals that Daniel had a high regard for Nebuchadnezzar compared to Belshazzar. There, Daniel 4 said that made the interpretation be for those who hate you. Here in chapter 5, Daniel says, "Let your gifts be for yourself." O King, Most High. Now what happens in 18 to 23, Daniel has a chance, and he's over 80, 83, 82 years old, and he says, "You're going to get a sermon. You're going to get a sermon, Belshazzar. O Most High, God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty, and because of the greatness and that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed. Whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him." Next slide. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was that of the wild donkeys. He was fed like grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven. Yet until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of the mankind and sets over to whom he will, and you, his son, see, Belshazzar, or your grandson, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of this house have been brought in before you, and your lords, your wives, your concubines, and have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see, nor do not hear or know, but the gods in whose hand is your breath, and who all your ways you have not honored. Belshazzar knew these things, and yet he had not learned from them. His heart was now proud and haughty, like that of his forefather Nebuchadnezzar. He exalted himself against the gods of heaven, and as evidenced by his profaning the holy vessels taken from the temple. His sin was shared by those who ate and drank toasts with him that night. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and the writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Next. Some of the scholars say the letters were those of a price tag and a certain money values were listed. Mene comes from the root to count, tekel to weigh, paris to divide. Paris is related not only to Aramaic verb for divided, but also for the Arab noun for Persians. The first word signifies the counting in order to limit. Babylonian days had run out. The second implies the weighing in the divine balances. Belshazzar and company had been found to be lightweights. the third word means that the kingdom was to be broken and had given to the Medes and to the Persians. It's as if God was, with his handwriting on the wall, is withholding compassion. In essence, God is simply saying, counted, lacking, weight, divided, that's it. Day over. And your day will come to an end tonight. Next slide. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold, and put on around his neck, and proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean was killed, and the Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay. Now you know the story about how the Medes and Persians showed up without resistance. They were moving in while the party was going on. They should have known. They don't have long-range glasses. They're all short-sighted, and they're 300 feet up on a big balcony. Given the Medes and Persians, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus relates that the Persian King Cyrus conquered Babylon by diverting the flow of the Euphrates into the nearby swamp. This lowered the level of the river, so the troops marched through the water and under the river gates. They still would not have been able to enter had not the bronze gates of the inner walls been left open and inexplicably unlocked. So there was bronze gates as well they didn't all climb in through the river because they didn't want to get their pants wet. Joking here, okay? Next slide. That was exactly what God said and was predicted in Isaiah chapter 44, 28 into 45, verse 7. God opened the gates of the city of Babylon for Cyrus and put it in writing 200 years before it happened. So there's a prophecy there that you can read. Also in Isaiah 47, we read these verses predicting the fall of Babylon. So, yeah, next slide. We're doing okay. I'm still alive. You felt secure in your wickedness, you said. So this is Isaiah 47. You felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. And you said in your heart, I am, and there is none besides me. But evil should come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. Disaster shall fall upon you, for which you will not be able to atone. And ruin shall come to you suddenly, of which you know nothing. Okay. October 13th, actually, 539 BC, Cyrus advanced into the lower Mesopotamia, and leaving Babylon still last, conquered and occupied the surrounding territory. Seeing which May the wind was blowing, Nabonidus of Babylon deserted his city, leaving it in charge of his son Belshazzar. The taking of Babylon was a bloodless and effortless, as Daniel 5 implies. The New Testament alludes to the narrative of Daniel in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. I keep thinking these slides in my mind. I keep saying way in advance. While people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them. So the book of Daniel is used as a framework for the New Testament writing of the Apostle Paul is alluding to Daniel 5 when he writes this, because in the Jewish framework of thinking, they would think about the Daniel 5 and understand what he's saying. What do we learn from this chapter? The deadly nature of the sin of pride. Pride is the evil response of a sinful man to the grace of God. It is taking personal credit for what God has given or accomplished. Pride was the root sin, necessitating and disciplining of Nebuchadnezzar, and we learn both from Daniel 4 and our text in chapter 5. Pride was also the sin of Belshazzar. It led to his blasphemous acts with his temple vessels and ultimately his death. The inadequacy of wisdom, number 2. 3 times in the first 5 chapters of Daniel, the wisest men in the land were summoned by the king to tell him the truth which had been divinely revealed. Each time the wise men were forced to acknowledge their inability to do so. Secular wisdom can never provide the answers for the all-important spiritual and eternal issues of life. Say amen to that. Okay. Learning from history, I am impressed that while Belshazzar's punishment was revealed by the writing on the wall, his king's sin was a result of his failure to heed the lessons which his father Nebuchadnezzar, grandfather, had learned. The basis for Belshazzar's judgment was his failure to heed history and the lessons from his father, grandfather. He failed to act on what he knew from history, even when the day of judgment was revealed through the writing on the wall. He still did repent. He has no regrets and senses no need to change. How many people do you know like that? I know a guy. This is just off the topic. I meet a guy. I take my dog for a walk across the Jubilee Road into the trails behind. There's a big pile of woods and trails everywhere. Meet this guy. His name is Kelly. He's retired. He came from Campbell River. Gee, I hope he doesn't hear me talk about him on this thing. Anyways, he doesn't have any awareness of God in his life or need for God, and I've got his email address, I've got his phone number, and I'm suggesting let's meet for coffee. So you work on these things slowly, and I have a friend that I've been sharing the Lord with for about 8-9 years now, and I tell him about the Lord. He came to our house and asked for prayer when he had cancer in his colon. And he went to go for some tests, and he asked us to pray for him. But when I sit down and have coffee with him and have breakfast with him, he says, well, you can never know if God really exists. Well, then why are you coming to my place and asking for prayer? But people are confused, and you have to maintain your steadfast patience and faithfulness. And, we just need a real move of the Lord in this day and age where people can sense God's move in their hearts. Next slide. Finally, we have the unseen hand from above who is working in all scenes. He is the Spirit of God who was in Daniel, giving him light, understanding, and excellent wisdom in Daniel 5:14. Number 2, he is the Most High who gave King Nebuchadnezzar a kingdom and a majesty, glory, and honor, Daniel 5:18. He is the God who gave Belshazzar breath in his hand, whom Belshazzar had not glorified, Daniel 5:23. 4, he is the God whose fingers wrote on the wall of Belshazzar's banquet hall, 5:24. He is the God who numbered Belshazzar's kingdom and finished it in Daniel 5:26. He is the God who weighed Belshazzar's kingdom in the balance and found it wanting. He is the God who gave Babylon to the Medes and Persians in 5:28. So God is doing everything. He's in charge of everything. Next slide. That's it? Oh, that's interesting. Forgive me for being goofy. There's a passage of scripture I want to read, and that is in Isaiah chapter 45. And it says that God, this night that Belshazzar died, God said between 150 and 200 years beforehand, God said to Cyrus, Isaiah 45, I'll just read the first 3 verses. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed Cyrus. He's actually saying that Cyrus, a God who doesn't need, a man who has no idea who God is, God's calling him his anointed. So God can choose any person, whoever he wants, in any time and place to do his work. Whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and to loose the belts of the kings. So the background of and the reason why this psalm was written is because he's telling King Cyrus that I'm going to give you Babylon. And he says to subdue nations before him and to loose the belts of the kings and to open doors before him, that gates that may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. He will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. That's what they had to go through to get into Babylon. And God is saying, look, you don't need to go down on your hands and knees, go through the river moat. I'll leave the doors unlocked for you. You know that ad that says, come on to our hotel, whatever. We'll leave the lights on for you. That's basically what God is saying here. The lights will be left on. Okay, and then there was another passage. Oh yeah, we have lots of time. Another passage I want to read is Psalm 90, because this psalm tells us what the character of Belshazzar was like. It says in verses 7 to 10, these, when you come here, you get surplus notes and information. It's so important. Now, this is from the human perspective, thinking about what Belshazzar was like as a person. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, and our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble, and they are soon gone, and we fly away. The frailty of life. Belshazzar met his end. Now, if you flip the page over to chapter 6, let's get into that one. Is there a... Okay, chapter 6. This is the final historical chapter. The theme remains the same, which is the sovereignty of God. At this stage in our study, certain patterns begin to surface. The chapters have 3 pairs. 2 and 7 go together, and 3 and 6, and 4 and 5. So when we looked at chapter 2 a couple years back, seems, we noticed that from the perspective of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, there's only 4 kingdoms. Babylon, Medes and Persians, Alexander the Great, Greece Empire, and then the Roman Empire. The same thing is repeated in chapter 7, and it's more expanded upon. So what happens with the book of Daniel is when God lays out a foundation in chapter 2, and then you get a basic framework of the ABCs of the Bible prophecy of that vision. In chapter 7, Daniel has the dream, not Nebuchadnezzar, and it's very in-depth, and it troubles Daniel. So if I were to teach the book of Daniel by theme, I would teach 2 and 7 first, 3 and 6 because they both have to do with persecution, and 4 and 5 would go together because they have to do with the topic of pride. That's just how it's arranged, and that's how Daniel arranged the books. He actually took chapter 7 and reversed it with chapter 5 for his chiasm, and we've talked about chiasms already. Next slide. Here's the chiasm. Daniel 6 chiasm. Verses 1 to 3, Daniel is preferred in the kingdom. 4 to 9, the jealous president satraps, government employees, persuades the king to sign the decree that everyone should pray to him. C, Daniel prays to God and is accused for it. D, the king attempts to deliver Daniel but fails. E, 15 to 16, the law is enacted. Daniel is cast into the lion's den. F, the king said God will deliver Daniel. Next slide. Now we're working our way back to the beginning. When you look at a chiasm, you compare the A at the beginning and A in the bottom, and you see when you get to the middle, the message of Daniel 6 is, the God whom you serve, he will deliver you. So if there's something that I can't stress enough, from studying the book of Daniel, we have a connection and a relationship to the book of Revelation. And these historical chapters actually teach us that if you're going to go through difficult times, God will deliver you. We have to have that, because when I listen to people that are on the news and on the end times and all the problems and all the phases, I would rather read the book of Daniel and gather an understanding for what the message is saying, because it gives you hope and strength. And you don't need to listen to CNN, global news, all those things. You can just listen to God's word and be reassured that he will deliver you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. Now, a satraps is a government employee, and I've said derogatory things about them already, and Now they're going to surface again. To be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one. Okay, so Daniel's one of 3, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So Darius actually picked up on Daniel's character very quickly. And I think that's something to be said for people that work in a non-Christian work environment. People will see your character more than you'll see your church attendance. I mean, mice attend church more than people do sometimes. I don't want to get into a rabbit hole, okay? So, of whom Daniel was one, with whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Okay, so you can see how Daniel is writing this up, setting the stage for jealousy. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find grounds for complaint against Daniel with regards to the kingdom. And they couldn't find anything. But they could not find no ground or complaint for any fault, because he was faithful, and no error fault was found in him. There is such a huge, when I read this through today, I felt terribly humbled by the fact that this man has had such an excellent character, and he was stolen from his family as a 15-year-old lad. He lived in a foreign country, and no calling of God, but he's just doing the right thing for the right time. And God is hinting at us that we can be used of him in the same way. And now Daniel is going to be paying the price for being faithful here in chapter 6. We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we make it in connection with the law of his God. These high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. Now, that expression is found in chapter 4. And when Daniel gets out of the lion's den, he says, O king, live forever. It's kind of a greeting thing that they use. O king, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the kingdom should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction. Liars. Daniel wasn't included. Next. Next slide. Okay, that whoever, sorry, my fault. See, more water. Now, actually, when you think of Darius, when you look at the King Darius' character, he sees there's something in Daniel, and he wants to promote him, and yet he's an honorable man, because these men make a conspiracy against Daniel, and they make him sign it. But he's a man of his word, and he signs it, and he says, let's see what happens. So that whoever makes a petition to any god or any man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the lion den of lions. So basically, you can be king, you can be God for 30 days. Why would you want to be a God for only 30 days? Want it more than that. But it's just a law that they made. Shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed it, and the document and the injunction. If Daniel knew there would be trouble, why didn't he just pray on his bed? Why make a display of piety and open the window? Daniel, please. Verse 6, and by the words by agreement also thronged the other occurs in this chapter in Psalm chapter 2 verse 1. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? So there's a connection there. Also in Luke 23:10, the chief priests and the scribes stood by vehemently accusing him. Verse 7, an obvious untruth. Not all the presidents agreed. There was a man representing all their presidents, and he wasn't consulted, which was Daniel. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went into his house where he had windows in his upper room and opened towards Jerusalem. Now it was Solomon that told him to pray towards Jerusalem, and he learned that from his ancestors. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plead before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning this injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petitions to any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king. That's wrong. That's false. Or to the injunction you have signed, but he makes his petition 3 times a day. When these enemies of Daniel accused him before the king, they stressed his Jewish origin. Then they asserted that Daniel despised the king. Not true. It was these rulers who despised the king for promoting Daniel. They were jealous and wanted his position. They simply hated Daniel and made their decision based on their lower instincts or their sinful nature. Jealousy is a real nasty thing. If you get it in your family, in a marriage relationship, in any relationship, on the job force. I remember working in the food industry, and there was a time where the job site had huge overtime, huge demands, not enough people working, and then the union would pick the boxes and put all the produce and all the dairy and frozen product together to get the trailers loaded on time. And the Ovoidi company, I wonder if I should say this online. Maybe not. Who cares? Anyways, the demands for the managers was so horrendous. And one of the supervisors, he was a manager, he came, pardon me? Yeah, his name, I can't say. He read to me what his boss wrote a letter to him. And it's all blame, and it's all jealousy, and it's all fighting, and it's all absolute garbage that these people don't have any answer for any problem that they've made. And they're supposed to be running a successful logistic empire, but they're blaming each other. And the same thing with Daniel's friends. They can't get along, and they're conniving. When these enemies of Daniel, did I read this already? Oh yeah, I did already. Next slide. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that this is the law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought to and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, like he has nothing else to say. He likes Daniel. He loves the guy. May your God whom you serve continually deliver you. That's an honorable thing to say, isn't it? Better than saying, good luck, buddy. Now, from the perspective of the liberal commentators, they say the book of Daniel and the chapter 6 especially, the only way that Daniel could have made his way through the night is because when he was thrown into Daniel's den, 2 things happened. The lions weren't hungry, so they wouldn't go after him. And number 2, they said Daniel found a crevice in the rock to hide. More garbage. Next slide. It's apparent that Daniel made quite an impression on Darius. It is best to save Daniel, but failed. Now Darius is showing signs of hope that Daniel's God will come to the rescue. One commentator, Keel, gives an account of a lion's den found in more modern times. We have no account by the ancients of the construction of the lion's den. Guy Host in his work describes the lion's den as they have been found in Morocco. So this is they say that it's same, how they made it in Morocco is same in Babylon. Next slide. They consist of a large square cavern under the earth, having a partition wall in the middle of it, which furnished a door, which the keeper can open and close from above. By throwing in food, they can entice the lions from one chamber into the other, and then, having shut the door, they enter and the purpose for cleaning it. The cavern is opened from above, and the description agrees perfectly with the text agreeing in the lion's den. The kind of construction would accept for the fact that Darius was able to converse freely with Daniel while he was barricaded inside the den, so you can still talk to him. Okay. Now, the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came near to the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Verse 18 illustrates the fact that it appears Daniel much better sleep with the lions than Daniel in his palace. There is no pillow like a good conscience. A good quote. Although Darius was accustomed to brutality and the execution of criminals, we see him showing genuine concern for Daniel. Notice how he addressed Daniel as a servant of the living God, and then he asked Daniel's God if he had delivered him. He had little faith in Daniel's God, but he comes running out to anguish for the first thing at the crack of dawn. Then Daniel said to the king, now this is the typical expression again. Daniel just spent the night with the lions, and he says, the first thing he says to Darius is, "O king, live forever." That's kind of like a saying, just an average night. My God has sent the angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. For the first time in this chapter, Daniel spoke as he called out in the response to the king. In contrast to the king's anguish, Daniel calmly answered with the usual courteous greeting, "O king, live forever." Most people in Daniel's predicament would cry out for deliverance. Daniel simply informed the king of the miracle God had done on his behalf. Amen. Then the king was exceedingly glad, and the king commanded that those... Now I did some reading on this, and it is true that this is how the law worked with the Medes and Persians. Those that Daniel had been taken Daniel out of the den, so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Oh no, they weren't hungry. Just look for a crevice. You'll be okay. And follow the liberal scholars. They'll protect you. Next slide. Then the king gave a command. No one had to ask Darius to do this. He was ready and willing to bring justice to those who plotted against Daniel, and also their children and their wives. This was the law in their land. This seemed very severe, but it was also according to the ancient customs among the Persians. An ancient writer named Ammianus Marcellinus wrote of the Persians, "The laws among them are formidable, by which on account of guilt of one, all the kindred perish." That's a pretty brutal law. Darius was not happy with these men. He probably would have cast these accusers into the lion's den, even if Daniel had perished in the lion's den. But that's a thought. The lions overpowered them before they ever came to the bottom of the den. This proved that there was genuinely angelic protection that saved Daniel. It proves there was no natural reason why the lions did not eat Daniel. Daniel's accusers perished in the same trap they set for Daniel. This illustration of the work of the cross in reverse. The guilty were punished and in the place of the innocent. Next thought. Then the king Darius wrote to all the people and nations and languages that dwelt with all the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers all and rescues. His works, signs and wonders in heavens and on the earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel prospered. This is the last link in a long chain set through this chapter. We see Daniel progressing in this pathway. He was plotted against, praying, praising, persistently serving, persecuted, protected, preserved, preferred, and prospered. So the pattern of exaltation comes after deliverance and the judgment upon the enemies of God's people. Next, God did not deliver Daniel from the decree of the king, nor from being thrown into the lion's den. Like we do that. We would say, Lord, let him get thrown into the lion's den. Stop it in Jesus' name. But in the New Testament, God did not deliver John the Baptist. Church history is filled with martyrs who died for their faith. The book of Hebrews 11 instructs us to base our faith on our eternal one despite the circumstances. So these are some of the verses that we tend to ignore when things get rough. We want it easy. Revelation 13 enlarges the picture of Daniel 6 and chapter 3. Again, false religion and civil powers will unite and condemn to death those who are blameless except concerning their preference for the law of God. The faithful, because they refuse to conform to a decree of false religion, will be surrounded by men as anxious for their death and hungry for them as lions for their prey. The message of Daniel 3 and 6, along with Revelation 13, stand together. They do not bow down, stay faithful.